Mr. Hitchcock, in almost 5 decades as a filmmaker, I think you're one of the few whose name has taken on a veritable adjectival significance. So I'm interested in how you yourself would style the Hitchcockian film. What is a Hitchcockian film?
Well, most people get the impression that it's necessarily a film which would be called a thriller, a suspense film, and sometimes mistakenly it's referred to as a mystery film. Now that's one department I do not indulge in at all.
You leave that to Agatha Christie and her filmmaking.
Yes, because a specific reason. There's a great confusion between the word mystery and suspense, because mystery means withholding information from an audience, whereas suspense means giving them information. Otherwise, if they don't have the information, they have nothing to be suspended about. So when you say what is the Hitchcock thing, it can be sometimes an oblique form of approach to a given situation. Another aspect is the effort to avoid the cliché.
And yet you often use very ordinary, commonplace kinds of situations to achieve your effect.
That is true, but you see, the use of the ordinary thing, to me, heightens. And sometimes the extraordinary doesn't work with me. For example, I once made a movie called North by Northwest, and it called for a man, Cary Grant, to what I suppose in gangster parlance would be referred to as being put on the spot. So naturally, what is being put on the spot? Well, now the convention and the unusual is to place him on the corner of the street, under a street lamp, the cobbles washed by the recent rains. It's night, of course, because there's a pool of light in which he stands. And then they cut to the black cat slithering along the wall, and maybe a face peering through curtains.
Cliché, cliché, cliché.
All
cliché,
the
yes.
time. So I decided I would avoid all those things and go for the very ordinary, and have him get off a bus on a road where there were no houses, no trees, nothing except
broad
fence,
daylight.
in broad sunlight, you see, which in its way you can describe as being very ordinary.
And yet extraordinary in that it was absurd. That is to say, Cary Grant was then being harassed and threatened by crop dusting a plane, and there were no crops.
That's the point. But you see, the first essential to get the ordinary mixed up with the extraordinary is that you have prairie-like land around you and a man in a business suit.
Yes.
Now, you see, there's your immediate counterpoint.
That's marvelous. It reminds me of Calvin Coolidge when he was campaigning for the presidency, you know, and he went off and put on Indian headdress in a business suit. Of course, he did it unwittingly, and you do it intentionally.
You see. Now, the next question was, if it's so ordinary as this, now you begin to gradually drift into the extraordinary, because you bring up the question, naturally, there's a plain dusting crops where there are no crops. So immediately your audience are beginning to sit up. And then, of course, it develops, it chases the man. But then comes the must, and this is a typical Hitchcock thing. The must is that you cannot have a crop duster in a scene without it dusts crops. In other words, the background or the elements contained in the scene must be used. So where does Cary Grant run? Into a cornfield and is dusted out. Merely to have a crop duster, call it a crop duster, and have it shoot by unknown people, of course, unidentified people, is not enough. In the same film, for example, Cary Grant gets trapped in an auction gallery. Can't get out. Surrounded, every door, he'll be caught. How does he get out? By bidding.
Yes.
You see?
Yes.
In other words, the shop, shall we call it, must be used, must be an important part of the thing.
Of course, one vital ingredient in all of this is anxiety. I think my favorite capsule description of you, or characterization of you, is Truffaut's, in this quite remarkable book, of which we have a copy here, Truffaut's Hitchcock, which he says that you belong among such artists of anxiety as Kafka, Dostoevsky, and Poe. Edgar Allan Poe, the inventor of poetry.
Yes, yes.
Now, you are, of course, quite literally an artist. This is really your
well,
beginning.
insofar as film is concerned, I am a purist.
You are a purist, but I'm thinking also of the way in which you set up scenes. Do you not visualize this and then actually sketch it out?
Oh, yes, it can be done. Oh, yes. You see, the creative process is always the best, you see. If I had my way, the moment the film was finished, prepared, visualized, I would prefer not to make it. And, of course, that doesn't really make sense because, after all, somebody once said, I forget who it was, that a play has not been written, finally written, until it's performed before an audience. It is incomplete. Merely to write it and put it down, even to cast it, is not enough. The complete process must be in front of an audience.
Now this I think introduces a very important kind of vein, because one of the distinguishing features of the Hitchcock career is this intimate kind of collaboration with the audience that I associate with you. That is to say, your notion of a successful film is one which is popular, is it not?
Oh, definitely, yes.
And one in which you engage in a kind of play with the audience.
Well, you know, let me put it this way. It's a greater challenge. I mean, I'm not self-indulgent, except only in terms of the manner and style of telling, and with the ultimate aim of presenting it to an audience. Now, the most important thing to me is not content. I'm not interested in photographing content. I'm interested in using film, using the visual, and out of that to create an emotion in an audience. Now, sometimes, you know, one is often criticized, but the criticism is always on the basis of the content. And then maybe they go and see the film a couple of times more, and I've often heard it said, oh, we saw things in it we never saw before. I remember when I made that movie Psycho, which was a carefully designed movie. It was designed to terrorize an audience, but only in their mind, give them a good sample in a murder in a shower, and as the film proceeds, gradually reduce the violence on the screen, but let the possibility of it remain in the mind of the audience. So there was a complete transference from the screen to the audience. And as the film went on, there was practically no violence at all, hardly any.
So the film image, then, is understated and is designed to stimulate the imagination of the audience so that the audience becomes collaborator.
That is right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after all, the mere fact that we'll say the murder in a shower is a thing of horror, of course, to me, is a thing of humor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can't do this kind of thing that we're talking about now without a great sense of humor, because you are imagining, when you lay these things out, the O's and R's and the stifled screams in an audience, which can only induce a sense of fun to me.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, most people don't realize that. They think one's an ogre almost for indulging in this kind of thing. For example, when I did this scene in the shower, cinematically, there wasn't a single shot of a knife touching a body anywhere. It was completely illusionary.
Of course, this notion of the sense of humor, I of course think of as intrinsic in Hitchcock and the Hitchcock film, the Hitchcock person. Sure. Although I'm not sure that's a meaningful distinction between Hitchcock the filmmaker and Hitchcock anything else. Isn't the consummate Hitchcock the filmmaker?
Oh yes, no question, sure.
And you are a celebrated practical joker in and out of film, are you not?
Yes, oh yes, I've indulged in that form of fun. But in this particular case, you know, being a practical joker, I suppose, does spill over into the films, because you are, what's the old-fashioned expression, laughing up your sleeve, as it were.
And what does this suggest of your attitude toward the audience? Is it a matter of a contest with the audience? Does it express contempt for the audience or admiration for the audience's
no, I don't think it's a contempt. In other words, the approach to the audience is not a negative one. For example, if you go into the area of practical joking, I once decided, I thought quite rightly, to have a birthday party for about 40 people for my wife. And I decided that all these parties that people have are all wrong, to sit 6 people at a table. And the whole thing becomes, you turn your house into a restaurant. There's no exchange with the people, a group get together, and they might just as well not be in your house. So I decided to get a very large round table that hold 44 people. And I did it by renting what they call TV tables, you know, they're about that wide and so forth. And I put them into a huge circle, black tables and rented white chairs. We had it in the garden, and I laid down some grass mats so that the damp of the evening wouldn't come through. But there was one thing I did which was not expected. The place cards all around contained Christian names, but not one Christian name matched with any of the guests.
What was the outcome? Where did people
Well, the outcome was you see that people gradually walked around with a sort of side glance to looking very casual, and the fun to me was watching them make the complete circle.
Hitchcock always does the unexpected. I suppose that's the norm of Hitchcock, is it not?
That's the unexpected is the expected.
Of course, I'm reminded of your own statement that you practice absurdity religiously. Statement to that effect. Now, what I want to ask here is really quite a serious question, I think. Namely, the extent to which you are a religious filmmaker. That is to say, is it important that you were brought up a Catholic, that you were educated in Jesuit schools? Is this an important index to the Hitchcock work?
only insofar as creating within me a fear that I have transferred to an audience.
Which really states the question rather better than I could have done, because I was leading to the question, the extent to which your film is, your whole work is autobiographical, not obviously literally, but figuratively. And you're really answering the question, are you not?
That's true, yes.
Saying that it is. So that this intimate collaboration with the audience is one that you're well qualified for by virtue of your own fears.
That's true.
Are we to regard your work then as Hitchcock's 5-decade psychoanalysis?
Well, I think that anything that would be obviously fearful to me gets transferred in a form of humor. And to create the fear in the audience, do you see?
Well, I'm very much interested in the sources.
I'm unloading, in other words, do you see?
This is a way of siphoning off those fears
My
and
fears
anxieties.
and give it to them.
Do you think that's altogether fair?
If they pay the right money, why not?
I'm always interested in the wellsprings, the sources of anxiety and suspense for you. I'm interested, for example, that children can be the source of tremendous anxiety and horror and fear. Birds can be antagonists.
Let's take the very beginnings. After all, as I've said before, a mother has in her arms a 3-month-old baby. And for some inexplicable reason, and I don't know why, she goes, boo, to the baby, immediately causing the baby to get hiccups. And the child nearly cries, but doesn't. It begins to laugh. And the mother seems very pleased at what she's achieved. Now that's the very beginning. What prompts the mother to create this element of fear in a 3-month-old baby? I don't know. Later on, when the child gets a little older and does something wrong, it's threatened with the bogeyman. You see. Then it gets a little older and gets to the age of 5 or 6 and goes on a swing. And what does it do? It goes higher and higher until it scares itself by going too high and stops. And then so on until we now come to the midway in the fairground where they pay money to go into the haunted house and come out giggling. They pay money to go on the roller coaster and scream with fear as it takes the big dip. And imagine the fine margin of those screams if that went off the rails.
And the most horrifying stories of my experience are fairy tales.
No question. After all, they were written by a man named Grimm.
Quite.
But you see, children, they talk about, the effect on children. After all, you have Red Riding Hood, which is cannibalism. And then you have Hansel and Gretel pushing the old woman into the oven. I mean, there are so many examples of the children's stories. I remember there used to be a very famous English artist, I don't know whether you ever encountered him, called Arthur Rackham.
No.
There were two. There was Rackham and Edmund Dulac. They were illustrators, but very, very fine draftsmen. And I remember these children's books were illustrated so that they would have trees, gnarled trees, and if you looked carefully, a face would be emerging from the wood, and these were all for the benefit of children.
Yes.
So you see, the whole approach in those in the Hans Andersen and the Grimms was to scare the children.
And you say for the benefit of the children. Do you really think it is? Just as I mean, you must have thought about its
benefit
effect.
after all. Why does a child receive a fairy story book as a present? Mm-hmm. That must be of benefit. And of course, you see, sometimes these things go wrong. You see, they don't. You know, we talk about violence on the screen and its effect on young minds and so forth. But I had a letter once, about a year ago. I did buy the rights to a play of Sir James Barrie, of course, as you know, wrote Peter Pan.
Yes.
And Barrie was shocked one day, soon after the play Peter Pan had gone on, from a woman who said to him in the letter, "You fiend, my 5-year-old child is dead, trying to jump through the window like Peter Pan." So you see, even the most innocuous things.
Most extraordinary. Most extraordinary.
But you see, look how among children, one little girl will approach the back of another girl very stealthily and go boom. Mm-hmm. Same as a little baby, but now they're grown up and they're doing it to each other instead of the mother doing it. Mm-hmm. And the other child jumps, and then there's a giggle all round. So you see, the fear thing is almost a psychological factor among all people.
Now, another of your concerns is, of course, death. Is this really incorporated within the framework of fear? I mean, what sort of place do you assign to death in your own films? Is this just a necrophiliac kind of enthusiasm?
No, I don't think so, because the death, it isn't the actual death itself. If you have your hero on the run, say from some, call them just for the sake of a conventional name, villains, it's the fear of his death, you see, the fear of it rather than the fact of it.
Of course, I'm thinking of the trouble with Harry, for example.
Well, that's the trouble with Harry, is really, that's typical English humor. Now, the English, strangely enough, you see, have always had an interest, both humorously and very, very definitely on the side of crime. It's always been a fascinating subject. Not only are they interested in it, the littérateurs I'm talking about, whether you go back to Conan Doyle or up-to-date Agatha Christie, or as I knew her, Mrs. Belloc Lowndes. And Mrs. Belloc Lowndes was a rather sort of cottage loaf, rather looked like Elsa Maxwell. And she was a very devout Catholic, rather a bit of a social snob, but she wrote the most horrifying murder stories, you see. And there seems to be a tremendous interest on the part of the English in this kind of thing, much more than any other country. You see, you can't in America, you know, you can put them on one hand, Dashiell Hammett and one or two others, you know, William Irish and or MacDonald, but the number of English, and not only that, some big literature, John Galsworthy or someone like that, would try their hand at it.
This isn't even to mention Shakespeare, who, of course, was
Well,
very much preoccupied
absolutely.
with Richard III and so on.
But you see, the English, then not only that, they do make, going back to the trouble with Harry, they do make jokes about death. One of the most fascinating true stories I once heard is that a famous comedian whose name was Harry Tate, and he was killed by a piece of shrapnel during an air raid. And at the cemetery, as the burial took place, naturally a good proportion of the mourners were fellow comedians. And there was a younger one who couldn't resist, you see. Comedians are always on, if you understand what I mean.
Yes.
They've got to be, they make some joke about something. Anyway, this young one nudged a very old one whose name was Charles Coburn, not the film man, not the film Charles Coburn, but another old boy. And he nudged him and whispered, he said, "How old are you, Charlie?" And the old boy said, "Oh," he said, "I'm 89. The young one said, "Hardly seems worthwhile going home, does it?"
This reminds me of that story, which I'm sure you know, about Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, who were lifelong friends. And when Lugosi died, Karloff was at the end of the long row of mourners who went up to view the body, and he went up and was heard to murmur, "Come on, Bela, you're putting me on." They were great practical jokers.
Yes, I see, yes.
What
Karloff was an Englishman, you see, and he would understand that. But the English always have made jokes about death and so forth.
And if fear and death are two main ingredients, the third that comes to mind is obviously your play with sex. Sex becomes a very important ingredient in your work. And yet a rather different form of sex from the kind of thing that we see on the skin flicks today. Of course, you take national pride in English attitudes towards sex, do you not?
To some degree, yes. Nudity for the sake of it, it would be like doing the obvious in other forms. In other words, it's a cliche again.
Yes.
You see, and there's no point in it.
Marilyn Monroe never starred in a Hitchcock film.
No, because you see, a Marilyn Monroe type would be so obvious to me that I personally would prefer to have an audience discover the sex in a woman, like in Grace Kelly, who very beautiful but looks rather cool until she gets down to the business of sex. Now you get an extra dimension by the revelation, you see.
So it's something withheld. It's again this economy and the understated.
It's the understatement again.
And do you think that English women are the world champions at this sort of thing?
I would think so. I think all the Northern European women. I think the further north you go, and I think it must be climactic. It seems to me that the Swedes and the Danes and the English and the North German women are extremely promiscuous. Then the further south you go, the more, how should we say, undemonstrative they become in terms of ultimately revealing themselves. For example, if you take the French woman, see, the French woman is not the folie bergère or the crazy horse or whatever it is. That's for tourists. The French girl is very protected. She may outwardly look sexy, but it's the family almost who decide who she's going to marry. I mean, it's as old-fashioned as that. Then you get further down into Italy, where they are all sexy and bosomy, but I'm sure the average man going up to one would find her run screaming for mother.
So you You give the lie in this way to the notion, the myth, as you would
Well,
say, of the warm-blooded Latin.
Cross the Mediterranean and the women aren't in evidence at all.
That's right.
I mean, well, not only that, but I've been to dinner, say, in a house in Marrakesh, in Morocco, where no woman is allowed to appear.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see, that's what I mean by the climate having something to do with it. They're completely withheld in the south, and then the further north you go, the more violent they may become, should you find yourself in some quiet corner with one.
To what extent, you're talking about women revealing themselves in all of the senses of that term, to what extent do you regard the audience, and perhaps yourself, as voyeuristic, as a sort of audience of peeping Toms?
Well, they are. I hate to say it, but there's a definite, especially in these sex scenes that you're seeing today, there's a definite audience identification.
But you play on this, do you not? I mean, this is one of your devices for hooking your audience and absorbing
Not
it
to
in
the
your
extent of putting sex on the screen and transferring that to the audience. That I'm not interested in. It's too easy.
But I'm thinking of some of the things that you've done that even to me as a rank layman are impressive cinematically because of the rigid limitations that you've imposed upon yourself. For example, Rear Window, which is one of my favorite Hitchcock films, in which you virtually never move outside of that room in which James Stewart is incarcerated.
And yet all I can say about it is it's probably one of the most cinematic films I've ever made. You see, people, especially technicians, are mistaken as to what is cinematic. First of all, the photography of people in dialogue is definitely nothing to do with the cinema whatsoever. It is purely an extension of the theatre. I've done it myself, and I know. It doesn't relate. Photographing of westerns, galloping horses, is what it is. It's photography, but not necessarily cinematic.
Yes.
Whereas, in a picture like Rear Window, you have a man sitting at a window looking. First piece of film is a close-up. The second piece of film is what he sees. The third piece of film is his reaction. Now here, in rapid succession, are three pieces of film put together, which is really what pure cinema is. The relative position of the pieces of film which create an idea, like words in a sentence. And out of these three pieces of film, an idea is born, and an audience react to that idea from the pieces of film that they've seen. For example, I describe I remember I was telling you that I did something for Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yes.
Well, I describe this process a little more explicitly. I say, well, Mr. Stewart is sitting there and he's looking out. And let us assume he sees a woman nursing a baby. Now you cut back to him, his close-up, which is the third piece of film, and he smiles. Now, for example, we take away the middle piece of film. There are only three pieces: his look, what he sees, and his reaction, and put a girl in a bikini. Now he's a dirty old man instead of being a benevolent gentleman.
And the audience is supplying this again. This is
oh, certainly. Well, because it's a subjective treatment. You are putting the audience in the place of Stewart. And they are verifying what he sees. When he looks out, by the constant cutting backwards and forwards, the images build up, the images that he sees, and the audience verify the fact because they're seeing it through his eyes. Now, the nearest form, I suppose, would be the novelist, describing this at great length, you see. But with film, of course, naturally, it's much more spontaneous than the novelist can do. And in regard to the theatre, of course, it couldn't touch it at all.
So whatever the source of a Hitchcock story, whether it's an original idea of yours or something that's evolved, you and, let's say, Joan Harrison or whatever, ultimately you are a film author. Is that
That's
not true?
the French expression, auteur. Yes. That is why when I work with a writer, I work from the beginning, because I want the writer to be involved in the making of the film. It's not the writing of a film. It's the making of a film on paper.
Yeah.
Like
Plastic
blueprints.
art, yes.
Like blueprints.
Which brings us back to your origins in engineering and
Oh,
and
yes, that all helped.
sort of-
I was a draftsman in engineering, and I studied art at the University of London, so I got a piece of each.
What about the ingredient of fantasy? It seems to me that much of the Hitchcock work is fantastic in the true
It is
literal
fantasy.
sense of the term.
It is fantasy. A picture like North by Northwest is pure fantasy, because you're supposed to have, it's supposed to be something about spying or something, but it's something that I don't bother about and I don't care about. In fact, I think I desaturated the concept of espionage in that film, because I have Cary Grant ask the head CIA man, played by Leo G. Carroll, well, what is it that he is after, this man, Mason? So the other man said, oh, well, let's say he's an importer and an exporter. He said, well, what of it? He said, oh, government secrets. And that's as far as one was prepared to go.
So you're not prepared to acknowledge your paternity of the James Bond films. That is in the sense of having inspired.
they're quite wild. They're overstated rather than understated.
Which of course brings us, by the way, to the MacGuffin. I'm delighted at
Well,
your
we've just touched on the MacGuffin, the question, what are the spies after? Well, in the days of Kipling, of course, it was the plans of the fort overlooking the Khyber Pass. That's what the spies were after. And then it went on to, well, you know, in a more serious sense, you got the atom bomb spies, you know, but that was rather serious. But generally speaking, the audience are not interested in this thing, which we do call the MacGuffin. Well, I'll explain to you the word afterwards. Because they're more interested in the character. The characters are worrying about it because they're running all over the place and chasing each other and killing each other over this thing, these plans of the forts or the plan of the bomb or what have you, see. Or as I had it in the picture, Notorious, samples of uranium, a year before Hiroshima.
That's right. You actually
We
did
anticipate
the atomic bomb and thermonuclear energy.
Oh, yes. When I went out to visit Dr. Millikan at Caltech with the writer Ben Hecht, we said, Dr. Millikan, how big would an atom bomb be? And then he spent an hour telling us how impossible the whole thing was. But I was told afterwards that I was under surveillance by the FBI for 3 months.
A very suspicious type, yes.
Obviously, but I was quite innocent in the matter. Anyway, going back to the name for this thing, whether it's the plans of the fort or the blueprints or whatever the information the spies are after, it did become so inconsequential to an audience but as I say, not to the characters, that we gave it a name. We called it the MacGuffin. And the word comes from the fact that two men are sitting in a train going from London to Scotland, and one says to the other, excuse me, if you don't mind my asking, what's that package above your head there? So the man said, oh, he said, that's a MacGuffin. Well, if you don't mind my asking, what is a MacGuffin? He said it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands. He said, but there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands. He said, well, then that's no MacGuffin.
Marvelous, marvelous.
So it points up that it is a nothing, but nevertheless, you've got to have it in the film, you see.
Yet, of course, one of your criticisms of many of the people whom you worked with and who are students of your film is that they become too preoccupied with the MacGuffin.
Well, I can tell you that the producer of Notorious, when he asked me what were these Nazis up to in South America, I said they're trying to get hold of samples of uranium-235. What's that? I said, it's the stuff they're going to make the atom bomb from. And what atom bomb, you know? So that's a bit wild, you know, to base a picture on that. So I said, all right, if you don't like uranium-235, we'll make it industrial diamonds. So, no, he didn't believe it. So he sold the whole property, sold it to another studio, and for a given sum and 50% of the profits. And I was coming back on the Elizabeth, and I met a producer who apparently had this half-finished script between Ben Hecht and I submitted to him. He said, how did you come onto the atom bomb? I've often been going to ask you a year before Hiroshima. He said, when we got that script, we thought it was the craziest thing on which to base a picture. I said, you made a mistake, as the other man did. And finally, I met the first man again 2 or 3 years afterwards at a cocktail party. He said, by the way, you should go to Germany, and your name has become quite big there since Spellbound and Notorious. And he said, by the way, in regard to Notorious, he said, you know, those Germans were very smart. He said, now that uranium is out of date, they changed it to narcotics.
The interchangeability of MacGuffins again.
But he lost 50% of the profits of the picture by thinking that the MacGuffin was what the film was about. It wasn't. It was about Cary Grant in love with Ingrid Bergman, helping her to go to bed with Claude Rains, that's all.
Which brings me really to another kind of question. Are there, as there surely are, favorite Hitchcock actors and actresses? And of course,
not really, not in the general sense. There are favorite character men I've had in the past, like the marvelously understated Leo G. Carroll,
yes,
who would measure the nod or turn of the head by fractions of an inch.
And I'm thinking now of Cary Grant for one, James Stewart for another. They seem to be very much a part of your work, and I wonder, among other things, whether you regard them as more or less interchangeable.
Yes, because you see, you have to remember, in order to get the best of the audience identification, your leading man in the adventure story, be it a fantasy or what have you, and in order to get the audience involved, one has to take every man. You see, if you notice, I've never made films about professional criminals or police or detectives and that kind of thing. I've always taken average man and got him involved in extraordinary. And that's how men like Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart have been cast, because they represent someone with whom the audience will identify and rather worry about.
Partly because they're amateurs in these extraordinary events they're getting
so
involved.
the audience, you see.
Reminds me of that great line when Chaplin is talking to Claire Bloom in a film, and she's concerned about her lack of professionalism going on to do a performance, and he says, "My dear, we're all amateurs." I suppose that's really what you're saying, isn't it? And
Sure,
that's the way to
the audience.
Mhm,
Sure.
mhm. And speaking of favorite or Hitchcockian actors and Hitchcockian performances, what about Hitchcock himself as an actor?
Well, I must confess there's a certain amount of ham there, but
You swing a lot of weight in your film.
yes. But on the other hand, you know, if I make an appearance, I always keep it down to the minimum, as I've often said, so as not to suffer the indignity of being an actor for too long.
What is the ultimate in this? Among all of your brief appearances, which began with, what, The Lodger?
Oh, well, yes, in The Lodger,
way back.
1926.
And you've appeared in virtually every...
Practically,
not virtually. Have you appeared in every film since
I
then?
think so, pretty well.
What is your favorite of all of these appearances as an actor?
The one I've never done.
The one yet to come in the next
I
film?
don't think it'll ever be done. I wanted to do a walk by with a girl and talk to her. And she slaps my face.
That's a marvelous joke. I think my favorite, by the way, is the appearance that you make in the newspaper in
Lifeboat.
In Lifeboat.
Well, that was a problem. I couldn't get in
Couldn't
the
get
other
into
way.
the
Except
there
for,
was no room for you.
No room for me there.
So you I mean, I'm sure that this is one of the memorable moments in film.
Yes.
Although I don't know that everybody who saw that film realizes that there you are.
That's right.
In a newspaper that
that
Bill
was
Bendix
the
is.
time when I was busy reducing, taking off 100 pounds. I suppose in one's lifetime one must have taken off at least 600 to 700 pounds.
That's terrible. That's frightening. And I'm not altogether sure it's wise. Anyway.
Well, it comes back. You get it off, it comes back. I think it's a physiological fact. You know?
Although I must get your recipe for consommé, which I think is one of your
That's
reducing.
a good diet food, yes.
Yes, yes.
No calories.
Are there favorite Hitchcock writers? You talked about this collaboration from the ground up in making a film rather than writing it or writing a screenplay.
I would say they vary. Actually, the method I used to prefer way back in England was to sit with a writer who was not necessarily a dialogue man, but a writer who wrote, shall we say, action, situation, and so forth. And I would then end up with a complete, detailed outline of the whole picture. It would be very hard to read because it doesn't contain any abstractions of any kind. You don't write in, for example, he wondered, because you can't photograph he wondered.
No, you can't. Although I think if anybody could, you could.
But you can't because it's an unknown thing, you see. So this complete, you can call it a treatment, you can call it an outline, give it any name you will. It would be, if you are able to read it sufficiently, because you would need a great sense of the visual to do it, it would be rather like looking at the film with the sound turned off. And that method I haven't been able to apply in America because the problem is one of screen credits and so forth.
Although, you know, I'm thinking back to an earlier comment of yours in which, right at the beginning of this discussion, you styled yourself a purist, and to be sure you are. But I wonder whether you wouldn't regard the ultimate in cinematic effectiveness the silent film. I mean,
No question. The day that sound came in, film lost a tremendous lot. In the days of the silent film, when we used to use titles, you know, there were three kinds of titles. There was a narrative title, of which, of course, the most famous was Came the Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
There was the character title and the spoken title.
Mm-hmm.
Character title would be, the moment a character came on the screen, he would be described, you see. Well, the great aim in those days by the purist was to make a film with no titles at all.
Mm-hmm.
And it was once achieved in Germany with a Murnau film with Jannings in the lead. Mm-hmm. And it was called in Germany Letzter Mann, known here as The Last Laugh. Mm-hmm. And it was a story about a hotel doorman who got very, very old and was taken off the job because he couldn't handle the trunks and so forth, and reduced to the toilet room with a white coat, and they took his resplendent uniform away. And the whole theme of the thing was the Germans' respect for uniform. And then what he did was to steal the uniform and put it on to go home, so that his family and his neighbors would never know that he had suffered this indignity of being reduced to the attendant in the toilet. He used to hide it in the check room at a railroad station. And of course the thing eventually broke out and so forth. But the film was made without a single title, made from beginning to end, as a purely pictorial thing. And it told its story just as much as today ballet tells its story in its own way.
Again, symbol, the symbolic stimulus to the imagination and so on, rather than words.
So that you see, when you get films made, I mean, there's still entertainment, but if we're talking on the purer side of filmmaking, so many of them are really not films. They're extensions of the theatre. They are really photographs of people talking.
Of course, the thing that comes through to me very strongly in what you're saying here is the extent to which film can be a vehicle for dealing with the most profound psychological dilemmas and problems of our society, which brings another question, because psychiatric and psychological themes, of course, have been characteristic of a number of your films. Psycho, I suppose, one of the most striking of these, Spellbound.
Yeah.
Are you accepted by the psychiatric and psychological communities? That is, are they among your critics or among your enthusiasts?
I've never heard from them.
You haven't? You
No.
haven't. But you do not have very high regard for those people you call the plausibles, do you? For those people you regard as the logicians, those people, in other words, who criticize the fantastic element in your film.
Well, to me, logic is dull. And very often, though, we are forced to lay things out because the audiences ask sometimes difficult questions. It's like a little boy who says to his father, "Why does thunder turn the milk sour?" And all he gets for his question is a cuff on the side of the head and "Get out of my way." So you get that kind of application of logic. The point is, of course, if you boil things down, everything must be logical, then Hitchcock kind of goes out of the window. And there are complaints, consequently, about being too, I've even, heard some people say that doing a film like Topaz, which is a bestseller, and it deals with espionage during the missile crisis, where I'm not permitted by the mere facts themselves to deviate.
Well, I'm thinking now of the extent of your preoccupation with film. There's a statement that struck me in the Truffaut transcript here, which you say, "My love of film is far more important to me than any considerations of morality." It seems to be a very striking kind of statement, and I wonder if you'd care to comment on it.
Well, it comes back to the question that I have no views either one way or the other about content, you see.
So that this is a matter of your being neutral, in a sense, in the presentation of your materials. And one of the things that seems to me absent in most of your work is political commentary. You are not a political man through the medium of your films.
No, but I think politics on the screen have always been very dull. You know, there's never been a successful film about Abraham Lincoln with the public, or any president, or for that matter, very, very few political films. The only one I know that's had any appeal to an audience is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But there, of course, you see, you get your identification not with a politician, but with average man.
Yes.
Going into the lion's den of politicians.
This suggests an answer to a question that's always bothered me as a historian. I've wondered why there are so few, if any, really successful historical films, and it's the political ingredient you're suggesting.
Yes, it is. It's because they deal in these broad terms. I mean, if you get films like The Young Mr. Pitt, or films about, I suppose they have broken out now and again because they've been made so theatrical, like